Spirituality has always survived oppression, and never by force, but by adapting. And that's why spiritual practices are still here today. If you think about it, if every empire, colonizer, church missionary had truly erased spiritual practices, there would be nothing left to pass down. But yet there is. There's a whole lot of it. There's a whole bunch of it. Because people over the centuries, they adapted, they endured, they found resilient ways to carry these practices forward for us. I would say a major early marker, a really pivotal point for us to start from, because it's going to be a bit of a history lesson, is 325 CE at the Council of Nicaea, which was done under Emperor Constantine. And the council worked to essentially consolidate Christian doctrine and unify the church. But this was more than just a vote on what we're putting in the Bible and what our doctrine is going to look like. More importantly, it signaled the point in time where church and state started to move as one. So what authorities labeled as heresy could now be punished by law. And this merger right here set in motion a very consistent pattern that we have seen echoed across history over the centuries. As Christianity spread throughout Europe over the centuries that followed, many local ways and traditions, their ceremonies, their rituals, these became outlawed, they became demonized, but some of them were also appropriated into the Christian calendar and into Christian practice. Yule is a really great example of this. The Germanic midwinter festival, which essentially honors the rebirth of the sun at the winter solstice, was appropriated into what is now called Christmas. So much of the familiar Christmas imagery that we have has pagan roots. So, the evergreen tree that you haul into your house every year, the wreaths that you hang from your doors, the mistletoe, all of it is rooted in pagan symbolism. Astara is also a really clear example. So Astara is the spring festival which celebrates birth and renewal, and its key symbols are bunnies and eggs. So obviously you guessed it, yes, Astara became Easter. The resurrection story, renewal, rebirth. So when your kids are Easter egg hunting, essentially they're hunting for pagan symbols. It's just wrapped up in a completely different story. And over in Siberia, we have the winter rites of the red-clad reindeer shaman who work with the Amanita muscaria mushroom, or the red and white mushroom that most of us are familiar with. We all know the red and white mushroom. And they were said to enter homes through the smoke hole. They would bring medicine and blessings at the sun's return at the winter solstice. And these symbols right here, the red and white, reindeer flying through the sky with the reindeer, dropping gifts through chimneys. Yep, Santa. I'm sure you figured it out by now. You're like, oh, Tam's talking about Santa. Yeah, Tam's talking about Santa. Santa comes from the red reindeer shaman of Siberia. And this isn't paganism adopting, it's appropriation. And even while these names and these symbols were taken and appropriated and turned into something else, the roots have endured. They've endured over the centuries, and they endured because these practices still continued in quiet groves and secret meetings and hidden gatherings. By the late Middle Ages, this repression and appropriation turned pretty hostile. In 1487, two German clerics published the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Witch's Hammer. This fun little handbook, I have it on my bookshelf, it actually exists. is what fueled the witchcraft hysteria. Essentially, it's a manual that teaches one how to hunt, terrorize, and essentially eradicate those accused of witchcraft. A century later, King James VI of Scotland, or later known as King James I of England, amplified this fear. In 1597, he wrote Demonology, which was a handbook calling for harsher measures towards the practice of witchcraft. And in 1611, he oversaw the King James Bible, whose language purposely reinforced suspicion towards witchcraft and occult practices. So here we see words becoming weapons, and accusations became a tool of power. Neighbors would rat out neighbors on like nothing, like no concrete reasoning, just because they could. And this pattern didn't remain in Europe. Colonization absolutely exported it for us. It wasn't only land and people that colonization was looking to overtake. Church-backed power purposely worked to erase ceremonies, languages, rites, traditions, stories, entire people. Here in the Americas, indigenous rights were completely outlawed. Their children forced into mission schools, and their hair, which is a deep symbol of power for many of the indigenous cultures in the Americas. This was cut as a purposeful form of disempowerment for these people. Colonists studied native traditions, not because they wanted to understand them. They wanted to use them as tools of control. But despite all of this, their practices survived, their traditions survived, they endured underground. Their ways were protected by medicine people, by elders who would safeguard their knowledge and would pass it down in ways however they could. Sometimes it was done in syncretic form. The transatlantic slave trade, we absolutely can't skip out on this one, because this carried millions of Africans into the Americas, and many were from the Yoruba traditions. And under this absolute brutal oppression that these people went through, they adapted through syncretism. Santería is a great example. In Santería, we have Orishas, which are deities that embody aspects of nature and human life. And these Orishas were paired with Catholic saints. So outwardly, it looked like they were practicing Catholicism. They looked like they were devoting themselves to the Catholic way. But inwardly, they always continued. They were still continuing with their traditions, honoring thousands and thousands of generations of how it's always been. Adaptation for survival is what that is. Over in India, under British rule, so British colonization, yoga and indigenous philosophies were very much dismissed, restricted. Like, we don't do that. That's nonsense. But by the 20th century, the West commodified yoga, stripped out the Sanskrit, the mantras, the philosophy, and sold it as a fitness class. Still, today, teachers of yoga, proper teachers of yoga, they hold the full tradition of the practice. They teach the entire practice of yoga. They keep that heritage intact, and they pass it on with respect and with care. In South Africa, apartheid shows us again what happens when church and state decide to integrate and become buddies with one another. The Dutch Reformed Church gave theological backing for segregation. That church said it's okay to say that white people are better than everyone else. So laws branded traditional African practices as dangerous or demonic. It pushed ceremonies and divination practices, rites, traditions, all of that underground. They were told that their healers were illegitimate, their ceremonies were criminalized, their sacred rites and their sacred spaces They were told that these spaces and places were evil and profane. That would be like me saying your church is evil. Same thing. Freedom of religion in South Africa was only recognized in 1994, and yet despite that legal shift, prejudice towards spirituality and spiritual practices absolutely lingered. In 1995, just 5 years after that law came in, my little teenage self in post-apartheid South Africa was cracking open her first books on Wicca and witchcraft and spiritual practices and, dipping her toe into the big, beautiful world of spirituality. And what I found was simple, gentle, nature-based paths anchored in a very consistent ethos of do no harm, be non-harming. But yet in that same year, I watched police touring schools, handing out essentially propaganda that equated practices like Wicca and witchcraft to practices like Satanism, which is a completely different belief system altogether, and equating these earth-based do no harm practices with crime and addiction. So the message was basically, sure, it's legal to practice what you want. You can read whatever books you want. You can be as Wiccan as you like. But just know that if you do, you're going to end up in bad places, because that's where all these pathways lead. I thankfully knew a whole lot better. Sitting in those talks, I could see how, under the guise of religious freedom, authorities still found ways to stigmatize and restrict spiritual practice, and under the guise of horribly misguided misinformation. When I began reading tarot professionally in the early 2000s, I had numerous clients coming to see me that were hella curious, but terrified. They were afraid. They were afraid that they were sinning, afraid that their pastor would condemn them, afraid that they were genuinely doing something wrong. So, like those before me, I adapted. I shifted my language. I used bridging metaphors and translated the wisdom of the cards in ways that people could hear, could understand, and be like, oh, I get that, that makes sense. Adaptation is not a cosmetic thing. It's not a surface level thing. It's how the work reaches the person in front of me. That adaptation was how I could still work with anyone who is walking through my door. And this oppression of spirituality and spiritual practices is not just in history. It's still absolutely alive today. In several US states, for example, reading tarot for profit is criminalized, sometimes outright, like you're not allowed to do that, and sometimes only allowed for entertainment purposes only label. And the UK makes use of similar disclaimers. Also, it's law, they have to do that. Many studios, yoga studios, still bar Sanskrit, they bar mantras, they bar the philosophy. These studios are essentially selling yoga without its spine. And commodification turns sacred tools into trends. In 2025, entanglements of church and state still shape policy and public sentiment. This hasn't gone away. Like we're still here, we're still doing it. And the pressure hasn't vanished either. It's just changed shape. It's just changed faces. It's just changed names. But it's still happening. It's still here. It's still very real. But yet spirituality endures. It endures because people adapt without surrendering the core of their practice, the core of their tradition. They keep what is sacred intact while changing the wrapper, so that the wisdom can continue to move forward. That is the lineage that us as medicine people stand in. And if you work as a healer, a teacher, or a guide, this is absolutely this is your invitation right here. Build resilience so that judgment doesn't stop you. Build adaptability so You can shift your language where needed, allowing yourself to frame you and what it is that you do across multiple contexts. Build endurance so that you can keep showing up no matter what the climate outside looks like, no matter what anyone outside of you is saying or thinking about you. And I'm going to be very honest here. Just last month, I almost let fear talk me into closing my doors. With the rise of very hardline rhetoric that is going on here where I live, and knowing very full well how these cycles unfold, safety became a very real concern for me. But a super amazing conversation with my awesome business coach pulled me right back. If I was feeling this way, my clients, the community that I represent, my practitioners, they're going to feel it too. And if someone with my years of experience and work can wobble, I'm definitely not the only one that's going to wobble. And as a mentor, stepping away when it gets hard would literally make me the opposite of what I'm claiming to be. So no, I'm not closing my doors. Don't worry, fear didn't win. I'm adapting. Again, I'm building resilience and endurance, and I'm going to be helping you to do the same thing. If you don't want pressure to be what ends your practice, mentoring is exactly where we strengthen these things together. The links are in the description. You know that these are the things that Tam helps you with as a mentor who's not closing her doors, who's adapting and adjusting and becoming resilient and building the endurance. She's here to very much help you do the same thing for yourself.